Way back in 1952, Alexander Douglas wrote a tic-tac-toe game called OXO, or Noughts and Crosses, for the EDSA computer as part of his PhD thesis at Cambridge University. Since the EDSA computer was unique to Cambridge, OXO was not very well known, but it was eventually rediscovered and declared to be the world's first video game. Coincidentally, Shigeru Miyamoto, who would someday create the most recognizable video game characters of all time, was born that same year. William Higginbottom was an American physicist who worked at the Brookhaven National Laboratory. In 1958, he created a game called Tennis for Two on the oscilloscope. Although the man only created this game to entertain visitors to the laboratory and he wasn't interested in being remembered for it, his Tennis for Two is recognized as the second video game. Another known early video game is Space War, a space combat game created by Steve Russell and his crew of MIT students for their school's PDP-1 computer in 1961. Other independently created games of the 60s would include Ralph Baer's Chase and Ken Thompson's Space Travel, which would inspire the first coin-operated video games ever created. In 1972, Atari was founded and created the first widely successful video game, Pong. The first version was literally a TV in a larger box with an opening to drop quarters to start the game. Atari would go on to sell 19,000 Pong machines. It is said that Taito's release of Space Invaders in 1978 began the golden age of arcade games. Around the same time, Ralph Baer's Magnavox Odyssey was released as the first home video game console, with its main competition being Atari's home Pong game. By 1977, most consoles on the market gave up, leaving only Odyssey and Pong. This was known as the video game crash of 1977. The second generation of home video game consoles began, and the star was none other than the Atari 2600. Competitors included the Magnavox Odyssey 2, as well as newcomers Mattel Intellivision and the ColecoVision, but Atari still dominated the console market for about 8 years. However, Atari eventually began to show its age. The popularity of games began to decline, and several game companies declared bankruptcy. This period came to be known as the North American video game crash of 1983. Iconic of the crash was Atari's E.T. game, which was so unsuccessful that the company had to eventually get rid of their large inventory of the game by burying the remaining cartridges. This was also the beginning of the industry's stigma for creating bad games based on movies. At the same time, though, some people began to say that this whole video game fad was over. Another important event that happened during this time was the arcade release of Donkey Kong, the first game designed by newcomer Shigeru Miyamoto. The hero of this game was called Jumpman and later renamed Mario. Donkey Kong was so successful that they created a spin-off starring Mario called Mario Brothers. People continued to believe video games had had it. That is, until a little Japanese company released a gray box known as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Nintendo was the beginning of some of the biggest franchises ever, including Zelda, Metroid, and of course, Super Mario Bros. The console is credited for single-handedly rescuing the entire video game industry from an early end. Without the Nintendo, we might not even be playing video games today. Also, in 1987, game designer Hironobu Sakaguchi and the nearly bankrupt Square Company released on the Nintendo what was to be their farewell game, aptly titled Final Fantasy. The game was such a huge success, it pulled the company out of bankruptcy and began the series they are still famous for today. The Sega Master System and Atari 7800 Pro System would try to compete with Nintendo, but couldn't do too well against the console's huge library headed up by Mario, so